The book has two dimensions, and one is so personal. And on that dimension, my book really is a love story, because when my father had this major stroke, I was living in California and my parents were living in Connecticut. And so I ended up joining what I call the rollerboard generation, which some of you may be in yourselves, where you're constantly packing and unpacking a rollerboard, and every time there's a family medical crisis, you fly to Florida or to Minneapolis or to one coast or the other to help out these people that you love so deeply, who are entering a completely different phase of their lives now. And I love my parents, but I was quite happy loving them from a distance. You know, I was quite happy being in California and having them be in Connecticut, very independent, living a sort of AARP, young, old age, vigorous life, you know. You know, they hiked, they meditated, my mother did yoga, they ate right. And I think a lot of us have an illusion that that is the last phase of life, and that somehow we're going to just keel over and die someday quite painlessly without ever having to transit through a long period of fragility. But because of what the miracles of modern medicine, that's very rarely the case now. If you think back in the 1400s, there were books that were written called Ars Moriendi, or The Art of Dying. And they were books that explained how to behave at the deathbed. They were almost like a play script. They would talk about what were the challenges, the emotional challenges of the deathbed, such as not wanting to leave this life, not wanting to say goodbye to your house and your hounds and your wife and your children and your castle or whatever. Not wanting to let go. I mean, for us, we would just simply say not wanting to let go. And these scripts would explain like what your friends and family who were surrounding your deathbed, because you would be dying at home, what they were supposed to say to you to help you go through this difficult emotional, spiritual passage. And so when someone felt a lot of remorse about, I really feel bad about what I did to my brother, then the people, your attendants would say to you, well, if you were to get better, wouldn't you try to make it right with him? Wouldn't you try to not do that again? And then the person would say, yes, of course I would. And then the response would be, well, don't worry about it. God is merciful. You will go to heaven. God, you have a chance to make your peace with this life and go on to what they believed came next. And at that time, people died throughout the lifespan. So you had children dying before the age of 2. If you go to any, probably burial grounds in Washington, if you go, you will see all those tiny little stubby graves of the children, and then the serial graves of the wives, who often died in childbirth, almost at the same time as one of those children. And then we had this miraculous modern medicine. We eliminated random death, and we eliminated premature death with things like vaccines and antibiotics and sterility, a sense of knowing germs and understanding all that. But then in the 50s and 60s, there was an explosion of post-war inventiveness and optimism. And we actually started to eliminate almost all sudden death and almost all natural death. So these amazing inventions like dialysis, respirators, pacemakers, defibrillators, extraordinary range that now can prop up any single organ of the body, which used to be called vital organs because they were vital to life. But now we have a lot of machines that can in some way temporarily substitute for the work of that organ. And the result is these almost an elimination of sudden death and natural death. And a horrible spiritual temptation for us, which is to avoid facing the pain and emotional suffering of knowing that you're dying, and instead hoping that there's always going to be another fix, always going to be another postponement. So I see that the problem that we're having with death now is a two-pronged problem. On the one hand, we have our own fears, and on the other hand, we have a medical system that is now primed for maximum longevity and maximum treatment, almost to the exclusion of all other goals. And what I've seen very much from traveling and talking to people is that there are other things that people fear besides death. You know, people fear dementia, people fear dying in a nursing home, people fear being a burden for many years to their families, and that these are values that also need to come into the mix as we try to decide how much and how long we want to prolong our lives. So that's sort of an overview of, I think, sort of the kind of the part of it that really interested me in terms of Washington, which I'll sort of get to in a little more detail in a minute. First, I just want to show you some photos. So these are my parents when they fell in love. They're on a playing field in South Africa, which is where they were born. And you can see my mother has run a foot race barefoot. It started to rain, and my father has folded her into his army overcoat. And you can't see from this picture, but my father had one arm. He lost his arm at the age of 21 in Italy in the Second World War. And he would have died had it not been for modern medicine, because at least our family legend is that he was given penicillin, which was only then introduced on a mass scale. Otherwise, he would have died of gangrene, you know. They left South Africa. They went to England, where my father went to Oxford for his graduate education. And then we all came to America. And he became a professor at Wesleyan University, and they had a very lovely and healthy life. And then at the age of 79, my father had a devastating stroke. And I'll show you a picture taken 2 years after the stroke. So. And if you look at it, look at the faces. My father has a look of perpetual confusion, which pretty much was his face from the time of the stroke until he died 6.5 years later. And if you look at my mother, who was an extraordinarily beautiful and well-groomed woman for the most of her life, I think you can see the absolute exhaustion. And then I'm in the middle. I'm the one in the middle, looking overly optimistic. And still dyeing my hair. This is about 10 years ago now. And she was exhausted already, and she was probably doing about 60 hours a week of caregiving at that point. And by the time my father actually died, I think it was probably more like 100, 120 hours a week, because my father not only had the stroke damage, which he never fully recovered from, but he also developed dementia and macular degeneration, so that he was going blind and could no longer read. And that was one of his great pleasures, was to read the New York Times in the morning. And unfortunately, a year before that picture was taken, he was given a pacemaker in a moment of hurry and hope. He needed a hernia surgery, and the cardiologist would not clear him for the hernia surgery until he got a pacemaker, because he had a slow heartbeat. And the slow heartbeat was not creating any kind of medical or physical problem for him. So it was sort of a just-in-case kind of decision. Very, very rushed. No real discussion with the family. And I think what's significant, I mean, especially in terms of being in Washington, is that Medicare paid about $10,000 without, you know, there's no sort of, there didn't need to be any kind of second opinion or thinking it through. At the drop of a hat, for the pacemaker surgery, but it would only have paid $64 to the family physician who actually opposed putting the pacemaker in, to have a really serious discussion about whether a pacemaker was a good idea at this point in my father's life at all. He was 79. Well, he was 80 when the pacemaker went in. And his pleasures were very, very limited. And in fact, around the time this picture was taken, he said to my mother, "I'm living too long." Unfortunately, the pacemaker cut off the most easy, simple, merciful path to a natural death. And so he lived into a time when death became when death became a blessing to him. And continuing to live really did become a curse for him, and also very difficult for my mother. So being a journalist, I just could not rest until I really understood what had happened here. And I know that there are a lot of you here who are involved in caregiving or will be caregivers, or know that you're contemplating the fact that you're starting to approach the end of your own lives, the last chapter of your own life. And I feel because our culture has been so strangely successful at eliminating so much death, and eliminating sudden death, eliminating natural death, it's almost like we all feel alone. And I really feel my hope for the book is that we start to have much more public conversations, like conversations in our own families and conversations with each other, with our doctors. Our doctors need to learn how to talk to us, and we need to learn how to talk to our doctors. People of my age who have parents in their 80s or 90s need to know how to start opening these conversations about what is the path to a good death and what's the path to a bad death. We need to start talking about this. 3/4 of people say they want to die at home, and only 1/4 of people do die at home. And a lot of the ones who don't die at home end up on a pathway to a way of death which is not the kind of death that they would have wanted. A lot of people say to me when I start to talk, I was writing the book, people would say, "Well, just take me out to a field and shoot me. If I get like that, just take me out to a field and shoot me." And take me out to the field and shoot me is not an end-of-life plan. And if you don't have an end-of-life plan, someone else will have an end-of-life plan for you. It may be your children who can't let go of you. It could be a hospital or a doctor where the default mode is still maximum longevity and maximum treatment in disregard of any other questions of human suffering or value. So think about it. And my feeling is that when people get into their 80s, we're like Humpty Dumpty at that point. We can still be looking quite good from the outside, but we don't have the same resilience. And a surgery, often a Hail Mary surgery, can be catastrophic for an older person and can again put them on a trajectory to a death, let's say in an ICU, that nobody ever contemplated or wanted in the family. So what I've seen, partly because I get a lot of letters now from people, is that someone's doing fine, but they're actually in that Humpty Dumpty stage where even a hospitalization, a general anesthesia can kick you into dementia. It can kick you into not being able to take care of yourself. And there'll be a kind of a blue skying by the doctor, which is, there's a lot of talk about the potential benefits of the surgery and very little about the very real risks. And then there's sort of a downward cascade, a downward spiral, and decision after decision is made. And 1/5 of us die in intensive care, which I think is an absolutely tragic statistic, because you're strapped down. You can't speak. You can't give your final blessings. You can't do your final forgivenesses. You can't say, "I'm sorry." You can't do the very important human and spiritual work of the end of your life. So that's kind of what the book's about. I'd like to read a very short passage and then talk a bit. And I'm actually contemplating doing something, and you can sort of think about it, which is just to turn to the person next to you and say something about why you came after I finish reading, why you came, and what is the really living, burning issue for you about the issues that I'm raising in the book. Okay? So I'll read a brief thing. Let's see if I haven't gone over. Good. I got 5 minutes. Yeah, well, so much much you can hear about death. You know, you gotta be, you can't overdo this. And there's a lot. I mean, the book is both a very honest picture of our family, because we were in no way a perfect family. None of us were saints in this whole process, but we did love each other a lot. And I feel that in the course of this, because it was about 9 years between my father's first stroke and my mother's death, I really did learn to be more open about my love for them and for other people too, to be more emotionally expressive, to not want perfection out of other people or out of myself, and to stop holding back and to just sort of let go more. And so there's kind of a redemptive narrative that runs through the book as well. It's about the emotional work we can do towards the end of life if we have the opportunity to know that we're dying, you know? Okay, so I'm going to read you about my mother's death. After my father died, and he finally died of pneumonia on a hospice unit, we had attempted to get the pacemaker turned off, which is both moral in my book and legal, and had been refused by the cardiologist. After his death, my mother, it became clear, had 2 leaky heart valves, and she was really short of breath. I took her to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, which was like, it's an absolute leader for late life cardiac surgery. And we went into the doctor's office to discuss this potential surgery, and my mother said, and he said, "Why are you here?" And my mother said, "To ask questions." She had become a totally different person from the person who had simply said, "Oh, okay," and put the pacemaker in and then regretted it, you know. And he talked very, very openly about the risks of both stroke and dementia for late life open heart surgery. And she said, "If I have a stroke, I want you to let me go." And she was almost crying. And he said, "But what about just a little stroke, a little weakness on one side?" And she also showed him her do not resuscitate bracelet she had already on her ankle, this kind of hospital-issued bracelet that you have to have in Connecticut to stop the EMTs from reviving you. And she said, "I want this to be honored." And he basically said, "No, we will not honor it. It would not be fair to the team. We're going to put a lot of effort into trying to save your life, and I just won't do it." And some people feel like, "Oh, what a terrible doctor." But my mother and I both really appreciated it because he was absolutely honest. And he didn't blue sky us. He didn't say everything's going to be fine. He didn't say, I'll agree to anything, but when we're in the heat of it, I'm going to do what I think's best. I mean, we really had a lot of respect for him. And when she came out from that, she was sent off for another angiogram or something, and then she came back, she put on her coat, and she said to me, "I will not do it." And over the next 5 months, okay, now I'll read. Otherwise, okay. My mother spent her last spring and summer arranging house repairs, thinning out my father's bookcases, and throwing out the files he collected for the book he never finished writing, saving only the love letters he'd written her when they were in their 60s. She told someone she didn't want to leave a mess for her kids. In her journal, she wrote about my father with a tenderness she could not express while she was caring for him. "I'm overwhelmed by sadness, missing the old Jeff as I knew him, his wit and compassion and his sheer liveliness. Oh God, how I miss him now." Her chest pain worsened and her breathlessness grew severe. "I'm aching to garden, to tidy up the neglect of my major achievement," she wrote. "Without it, the place would be so ordinary and dull. But so it goes. Accept, accept, accept." My mother's heart nurse called me, urging me to get my mother to reconsider surgery. My mother was so healthy in other ways, the nurse said. Uneasy, I called her personal doctor, Dr. Fales. "I know your mother well enough, and I respect her," he said. "She doesn't want to risk a surgery that could leave her debilitated or bound for a nursing home. I think I would make the same decision if it was my mom. I called my mother and said, "Are you sure? The surgeon said you could live to be 90. "I don't want to live to be 90, she said. "I'm going to miss you," I said, weeping. "You are not only my mother, you are my friend." That August, she had a heart attack. She was still in the hospital, in a step-down unit after several days in intensive care, when I got a call from yet another member of Middlesex Cardiology Associates who'd been handed my mother's case. The desire of doctors not to give up on my mother, to resist death, and to show their caring by doing something, anything, seemed unstoppable. The doctors were considering giving my mother coronary artery bypass grafts plus the 2 valve replacement surgeries she'd rejected when she had a far better chance of surviving them. My mother seemed to be heading down the greased chute toward a series of Hail Mary surgeries, risky, painful, dangerous, and harrowing, each one increasing the chance that her death, when it came, would take place in intensive care. The cost to Medicare would probably have been in the $80,000 to $150,000 range, with higher payments if things had not gone well. More than a third of Medicare patients have surgery in their last year of life, nearly a tenth have surgery in the last month of life, and a fifth die in intensive care. Burning with anger, I told the astonished cardiologist that my mother had rejected surgery before her heart attack, and I saw no reason to subject her to it now. My intuitive revulsion, I would later discover, had a basis in medical evidence. One major study found that 13% of patients over 80 who underwent combined valve and bypass surgeries died in the hospital. In a smaller, confirming study, 13% died in the hospital, and an additional 40% were discharged to nursing homes. I called my mother in her hospital bed. "I think we're grasping." I stopped. "At straws," she said, finishing my sentence. She was quiet. "It's hard," she said, "to give up hope." 4 hours later, she called me back. "I want you to give my sewing machine to a woman who really sews," she said. "It's a Bernina. They don't make them like this anymore. It's all metal, no plastic parts." "But I'd like it," I said. "But Katy," she said, "you don't sew." I said, "You're right." "I'm ready to die," she said. "I'm at peace with all my children." She was overflowing. She told me she'd found a little spiral-bound book I'd made for her 80th birthday. "It was so loving," she said, "and oh, Katy, I didn't appreciate it." "Cherish Brian," she went on. She was talking about my partner, Brian. "You mean stop being a snob and cherish Brian?" I asked. "That's exactly what I mean. I love Brian," she said. "I love Brian for what he's done for you." An old Zen master once wrote, "Old plum tree bent and gnarled, all at once opens 1 blossom, 2 blossoms, 3, 4, 5 blossoms, uncountable blossoms, whirling, changing into wind, wild rain, falling, snow, all over the earth. My mother was like that." She came home from the hospital. My mother watched a moth emerge from a chrysalis brought over by a neighbor child and took her last photograph of its wet, crumpled wings. She took out her calligraphy pens, and on a small piece of paper, she brushed out her final circular enso and wrote beneath it, "For my memorial service." Three days later, I called her. I'd just come home from my local bookstore, where a former student had read from his new book about the ritual of tea, and I couldn't stop thinking of her. I remembered how she'd swirl boiling water into her beloved Japanese iron teapot to warm it. I remembered her attentively setting out thin, white bone china cups for my father and me. I remembered how, no matter how badly things were going, we'd gather each day at the kitchen table, waiting as the tea steeps, enjoying one another and simply being alive. But I had been too defensive and clumsy, too afraid of her criticism, and too much of a feminist bookworm to learn from her how to do this. In an outpouring, I told her all this. She was the one who had put her compassion into action and honor her vows and taken care of the man she'd loved. But Katy, she said, her voice weak, after I finally finished talking, you are yourself. You're good at other things. Then she said, there isn't much time. That night she could not stop vomiting. She was taken back to the hospital with my brother following the ambulance in her white Camry. Don't call your siblings, she told him when they got to the hospice unit. They'll only panic and come. She had dry heaves and could not catch her breath. She took off her hammered silver earrings and said, I want to get rid of all the garbage. She told my brother Michael to call my brother Jonathan and me. By the time he came back from the phone, she was dead. He broke into sobs. It could have been too much self-administered morphine or too little potassium. It could have been the stress of a cardiac catheterization. It could have been getting up and making martinis for the people who'd stopped by to see her. In the end, does it matter? She died of old age, sickness, and death. She died of a heart calcified and broken by 6 years of nonstop caregiving. She died of being 84. She was continent and lucid to her end. She took back her body from her doctors. She died the death she chose, not the death anyone else had in mind. She reclaimed her moral authority from the broken medical system that had held her husband hostage. She died like a warrior. Her dying was painful, messy, and imperfect, but that is the uncontrollable nature of dying. My brother called it a triumph. So that's it. So I'd love to entertain both questions and comments. I feel like this is a public conversation that we need to start having if we want to have the kind of deaths that are meaningful for us. Not necessarily easy, not necessarily without suffering, but have meaning for us, that are good deaths for us the way we define them. So I want to just start. Would you just take a minute and just turn to the person next to you and say something about why you came tonight, or anything, any thought that was inspired by reading from the book? I know it's Washington. I know it's not California, but, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think we're gonna wait. Yeah. Great. All right. Okay. All right. I hope you met somebody you didn't know before, or perhaps, or said something you might not have thought of saying before. Yeah. No one's going to talk to me. Yeah. Great. So thank you. Thank you for trying my experiment. I really appreciate it. Yeah. And so let's, there's one mic or two mics?
Two mics, one on each side.
Okay, there's two mics. So great. Great. Yeah.
And you, in retrospect, you look back at your father's having had the pacemaker inserted as a mistake.
Yes.
But I remember reading your article in the Times, and it seemed to me he had many good years after he had, and many good times after he had the pacemaker inserted. So,
Good question.
it's a hard decision because he wasn't about to die when he had the pacemaker inserted.
Exactly.
So, what would you do now?
I would have, first of all, I want to clarify, after the stroke, he had 2 years where he used to walk down to the neighborhood pool and do water exercises, and he really struggled and worked to get better. He also worked on writing an autobiography. But there came a point, which was about 2 to 3 years after that, where he no longer could remember how to turn on the computer, so he couldn't write his autobiography anymore. And then, of course, as the years went on and he became more blind and incontinent and therefore couldn't go to the pool. This is like
was
3.
The pacemaker?
The pacemaker was 1 year after the stroke. I'd say he had okay years for the first 2 after the stroke. Round about the 3rd, he started to say, I'm living too long. You know, what I would have done differently is I would have flown out. I was in California. I would have flown out and I'd say, let's slow this decision-making process down. This decision does not have to be made tomorrow. We can use a truss. He can have a truss for the hernia so he's not in pain, so we don't have that sense of urgency. And let's really talk to the family doctor. Let's realize that what we're exploring here is not a simple no-brainer minor surgery. We're also talking about how much suffering do you want to exchange for more time on Earth? Now, it's perfectly possible that if we'd had all of those conversations, that my parents would still have decided it was a good idea to go through with the pacemaker. But hopefully we would have known, if we'd had real discussions, that it could be turned off painlessly without another surgery, that we had the legal and the moral right to ask for that when it was appropriate, and that our decision-making to make such a decision could have been normalized or validated as an option. And none of that happened. So that's what I would have done differently. I think we would have felt more empowered and been more at peace and felt less betrayed by medicine if those discussions had taken place, which is exactly why that $200 so-called death benefit from Medicare is so important, that we actually fund these discussions. It's not fair to the doctors for us to expect them to do all of this stuff for free, you know, especially with an aging population and a large number of people, you know. So that's what, you know, I would have still been against it probably, but it wouldn't, you know, I think we would have been much better informed and with a map for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you mind lining up to the, yeah? Okay, yeah.
I'm a hospice chaplain here in D.C.
Yeah.
And a couple of comments before my question. One is that I had a patient a couple of years ago who had a pacemaker and a very long decline. She was bedbound the whole time that I was visiting her, and she was on our service for 2 years.
Wow.
And she came to a place where she said, I want it turned off. And we went through an ethics consult, and we were able to have it deactivated.
Mm-hmm.
And she continued to live for a period of time afterwards with her own heart beating. But she died more peacefully because she had some control over that thing that was keeping her going.
Yeah.
In my own family, my mother had advanced multiple sclerosis. This was in the 70s, and she was in and out of comas. And her doctor said she could no longer swallow. And he said an option for her was to put in a feeding tube. Now, I have 2 older sisters, and the 3 of us didn't have agreement. 2 of us felt like, what was the point? She had no quality of life. And the 3rd one said, well, would you like our mother to die of starvation?
No.
How would you like that? And so in the end, the doctor put in the tube, and thankfully she didn't last more than another few days. I don't know what it would have been like had she lived longer. But now, as a hospice person, I know that when the body is no longer able to function properly, if you can't swallow anymore, the body's wanting to shut down, and that's the natural part of dying. So my question is, we now have this thing called DNR. Mm-hmm. You know, people wear the DNR bracelets and all that stuff, which means do not resuscitate. And it's a very harsh sounding, don't do that, when you can do something, and everybody wants to do something. Mm. So there's another term that I learned about a few years ago called AND, which is allow natural death. Yeah. But I'm not seeing it out there yet. And I'm wondering, have you seen it? Do you know if there's a movement how we can help bring that about.
I think, well, just you mentioning it and all of us hearing about it is really part of it. I have seen research that shows people are much more likely to respond positively to signing something that says allow natural death than they are to signing something that says do not resuscitate. Just as if you have, someone with a dementia as a patient and you say comfort care only, that is something people can live with a lot better than no more medical care, because it's not no more medical care. It's a shift in what you're trying to do. You're trying to alleviate suffering. You're not trying to extend life. And so I think it's a very, very important thing. And when I talk, I use that phrase a lot, allow natural death, because that's what my father was deprived of, was being allowed a natural death when that was in the cards for him and would have been a merciful passage for him, a pathway, a more merciful pathway. And I think what's so interesting is I've also read research that says that it's not painful to stop eating and drinking and die that way. And, being from California, of course, I have, at certain points in my life, I fasted for 5 days or so, and it isn't painful after the first day or so. It's not the same as those poor children with the stomachs out who are getting a little tiny bit to eat all the time. Your body does something very, very different when you're not eating or drinking at all. So I think that's also important for people to know. And when people say something like, well, do you want our mother to starve to death? The illusion is that there's a choice between a painful death of starvation and some kind of unimagined, painless death that's not really defined or drawn a picture of. And the fact is, I'm not a medical person, but I really doubt there's a way to eliminate all suffering on the way to death. And certainly the ICU deaths are a very, very harrowing way to die that leaves survivors traumatized and at war with each other and with high rates of anxiety and depression. So there's this kind of illusion that I thought when I first started writing the book that if let's say someone dies in intensive care, I thought, well, at least the children feel the medical profession did everything and pulled out all the stops and really tried to save them. But since then, while I was writing the book, I discovered the research, which is that people are actually more traumatized by those do-everything deaths than they are by deaths that have a decent pathway, So, yeah. Anyone else? Did you want to get up? No? Come on, this is Washington. Surely somebody wants to talk. Do you mind using the thing? Because they're recording it. It's because of the video. Oh, yeah, please.
I actually don't have a question. I have 2 comments and would appreciate your feedback. I am a hospice nurse in Maryland, and one comment in response to the chaplain who just spoke is that in the state of Maryland, there is a new document I believe started January of 2013 called a MOLST form. Some of you may have heard of it. It's an acronym for Maryland Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, and there is no DNR. That there are a number of options, and what they call the MOLST B option says do not allow natural death to occur. And there's more language than that. But so I don't know what the DC situation is, but I agree with you 100% that that adding that word natural, I think, normalizes the experience. And certainly you can download it. You can Google it and download it and send it to your doctor. And anyway,
right,
and my comment is I was really struck by your reading about doctors who feel like they have to do something. We need to do something. And in hospice, we say there's always something to do. It may not be a surgery, but it's reframing that whole conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's very unfortunate that the way the medical system has evolved, which has to do with big lobbies, for advanced medical devices and pharma and all of this, that we pay providers much better for technology than for their time. And they are time starved. And these conversations take time. And late life medicine really takes time. And so I would love to see the dollars shifted. And then also, in a lot of parts of the country, those forms are called POLST, Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, and they're much more likely to be observed and honored in a hospital than your own personal advanced medical directive, because it's actually an order from another physician. So to go against another physician's orders is politically much more risky in a hospital than to go against a patient's requests or desires. So that's the practicality of the hospital. There's also a phrase in the hospitals that I dealt with called the nephew from Peoria. Yes. The nephew from Peoria is the somewhat estranged family member who flies in at the last minute and insists that everything be done. Often they're not the people who've been involved in caregiving, so they're not really up to speed with the condition and the suffering of the family member, and perhaps they sometimes feel guilty or unresolved, and they can't really handle the shift that's going to take place. So I think it's very important when you talk about these documents to realize the documents are just an emblem of a much deeper kind of family conversation that needs to take place, that you need to get your family members, even your nephews from Peoria, I mean, we all have them, right? To really have conversations so they can understand what your deep wishes are and to hopefully sign on to them, Yeah.
Do we have the right mix of doctors dealing with patients that have end-of-life problems?
No.
There aren't a lot of psychiatrists. When my father was dying, I thought maybe we could spark him back into the recovery. And I asked the psychiatrist to come in and look at him. I think from the tone of the conversation tonight, I don't know if there's a leveraging that could be gotten from having people who really don't have as their major objective maintaining end-of-life possibility, and essentially trying to act as a temperate thing to focus people more on human issues.
Yeah, I think it's a real problem, because when dying moved out of the home and into the hospital, dying was really a spiritual task in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, 19, or even the early 1900s. It was a spiritual task, and it happened at home. The priests would come and sit by the bedside. You need ministry at that point more than you need technicalities. And then when it moved into the hospital, all of the kind of the ministry and the emotionality really was kept outside the door, kept to visiting hours. And it's a real problem. And for example, geriatrics is the only specialty where you get additional training and you actually make less money than you did if you were just an internal medicine doctor. I think we need to triple the daily hospice benefit. So instead of being $150 a day, it's like $450 a day, so people could get real extended home nursing as well as the social work that needs to happen toward the end of life. And you should be able to be in hospice for a year and a half, because you can only be in it right now. You have to be within 6 months of dying. And yeah, some people can. But I had really incredible trouble getting either of my parents into hospice because they weren't sick enough yet. And they died within a couple months, Mm-hmm. So I think both of those changes, we really need to turn Medicare upside down so that it really rewards doctors' time much better and is much more skeptical of these late life interventions like pacemakers and especially internalized defibrillators, which actually can go off and shock you on your deathbed repeatedly if they're not turned off. I mean, they really have to be. I mean, a pacemaker, you can say it's a judgment call or it's an individual value decision, but the internal, it's a source of absolutely unbelievable medically created suffering if it's not turned off before active dying. Yeah. It's electric shock. You're getting shocked. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you please speak a little bit more about the policy implications of this and how the high costs of the Hail Mary surgeries might be put to better use when they're being covered by Medicare?
I think we ought to have a Medicare Plan Q, which would be an option that you could have when you signed up for Medicare, where you would say, I promise not to insist on being in an ICU over the age of 80. I promise that if I'm a man, I will not insist on Provenge, which is a $50,000 a year drug for prostate cancer with very, very minimal, if any, benefit. I will sign off on the ICD, on the internalized defibrillator, which is $35,000 to put in and $25,000 a year to maintain, and just run the checks on it. I promise to eliminate all those things if you'll give me more palliative care, more nursing care, more home health care. A quarter of the Medicare budget goes to the last year of life. 30% of people are in intensive care in the last month of life. A third of people have a Hail Mary surgery in the last year of life. A tenth have it in the last month of life. The money involved here, I mean, it's at least $150 billion that is spent on that last year of life. And of course, you'd still be spending money even if you had much better palliative care and people were dying the way they say they want to die. You'd still be spending money on that last year. But I think you could shift it to much more humane uses, and also just cut down on. I mean, one of the stories that's in the book is a friend of mine. She's now a friend of mine. Her father was 88 with dementia, living in assisted living. He was suddenly struck really ill, and even though he'd signed all the right documents, they hadn't really thought through the implications of those documents as a family. So he got rushed to Stanford Hospital. He died, long story short. It took 10 days for him to die, and it cost $323,000. Now, if even 5,000 of those dollars had been spent on social work with the family in the last 2 or 3 years of that guy's life, he would have been saved a great deal of suffering in his last 10 days, and we would have been saved a whole amount of money, So I guess we should time one more?
Thank you.
What? Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. My name is Liz, and I'm also a chaplain. I worked in a big urban hospital, Washington Hospital Center here, and I've also now work in hospice. And what I'm curious about is budgets for healthcare are rapidly shrinking. So is the role of chaplains and social workers. And I wonder if you had any experience with chaplains in all these years that you were on this journey with your parents. And I also think there's a huge misconception about the priest at the deathbed at the end of life. And in our increasingly secular and multi-faithed society, there's a lot of prejudice or fear around spiritual care and what that would look like. I don't want, a lot of people, I don't want that priest, but maybe they do need someone to help guide a conversation about the spiritual aspects of end-of-life care. So I wonder if you could talk about your experience with that.
Well, I did ask an Episcopalian chaplain to give my father last rites, even though my father was an agnostic and my mother and I were Buddhists, and none of us believe in heaven, none. And it was very, it was very conventional in the sense of the role of the chaplain that the chaplain played with us. It gave me tremendous emotional relief to sort of verbalize turning my father over to these greater powers, even though the language wasn't my language, it really worked. In the hospice movement, they talk a lot about 5 tasks for the end of life, which are thank you, I love you, please forgive me, I forgive you, and goodbye. And you can do those tasks without having any kind of explicit end-of-life conversation with a parent. I mean, you can start that work, or with your children, even if your parent doesn't want to talk about anything like that. And I think they're very, very important. And I mean, I think in some ways, we couch them more in emotional or psychological terms now than we do in spiritual, but they're not that different from the ones from the Ars Moriendi, where they talked about them all as temptations to sin, which is not our language. There's also a beautiful book called Sacred Dying, if any of you are really interested in this. It's a woman she's a theologian, she goes into hospitals, and she kind of does a ritual that fits with both the religion and the values of the people who are involved. So she doesn't impose a Tibetan Buddhist ritual on a Baptist family, but she does stuff that fits. And I think we need some kind of rite of passage. I mean, it is one of the biggest passages I can think of. And to think about what those rites of passage might be for it could be playing a really beautiful piece of music, something that was loved. It could be reading a Shakespeare poem out loud, So I think we should stop and I should sign books. And I just want to finish with a very short story, which is that Brian, who's right there, my partner Brian, grew up in Queens in a duplex. And the other half of the duplex was his cousin George, who's now an auto mechanic on Long Island, has only a high school education, and cousin George's mother was Aunt Dot. And when Aunt Dot was 92, she was at a family party. She had like a massive fainting spell. She was taken to the hospital. They said they wanted to keep her overnight and run numerous tests. And George is like at least 6'4" and probably over 350 pounds, okay? And he only has a high school education, but he was very devout Catholic, actually. And he just leaned over the doctor and said, "Ain't freaking gonna happen." and the doctor said, "Are you saying you want to sign your mother out against medical advice?" And he said she was halfway through eating a piece of red velvet cake at a party. All she wants to do is go home and finish her cake, and that's what we're going to do. And he took her home. And long story short, there were several iterations of similar encounters over the next 5 years or so. She died at 97 in her own bed, and she was never subjected to any of these Hail Mary surgeries or unnecessary doings. And so his story really gives me some faith. You don't have to be me. You don't have to have like spent 3 years researching and proving that you were right. You know, it's like, you know, he prayed about it, he thought about it, and he stayed in touch with his common sense. And I think a lot of us have lost touch with our common sense, and we defer a lot to experts now. And you can get back in touch with your common sense and make sure that the people you love get to eat their red velvet cake. Okay?